What a gift it is to be here among faces old and new. I'm so glad to be in worship with you this morning. It probably comes as no surprise to you that there are some places that you could preach that are a bit more raw than others. I experienced this firsthand when during seminary I used to lead worship services at Trenton State Psychiatric Hospital, and patients would often interrupt the sermon with a hand raised with a question, or maybe just a question blurted out. How are you supposed to love your neighbor if you can't love yourself? I remember was one that stopped me in my tracks one time. But I still love best the story about a fellow seminarian who was newly testing out her preaching legs at a nursing home. The worship service was held in the lobby of the home, and many of the residents, some in wheelchairs, made their way from their rooms, assisted by nurses and aides. It seems that one of the gifts of great age is the freedom to speak one's mind freely and openly. And when the student had spoken only a few sentences, a stooped woman seated on an electric scooter suddenly whirled the scooter around and headed back to her room, shouting, blah, blah, blah. What would it look like if the surface of things was stripped away? Do you assume it wouldn't be pretty? That, for instance, people in worship, given the freedom to react to how things really sound, would blurt out, blah, blah, blah. Let's not test that one out today. Though there's some pretty good evidence that if we took that liberty in general, we could be in for facing some difficult truths. Surely most of us could bring our own examples of times when we have tried to manipulate reality to conform to what we want rather than to what is. Anyone ever had that unexpected call that someone was coming right over just for a minute and you rushed around to stuff things into closets? I hear that's something that some people do. There are probably many surface examples that we could readily name like that. And then there are those that would take a little more work to truly uncover. What becomes dangerous, of course, is when we really buy into the alternative narratives we create or are created for us by society. And of course, all too often we do buy into the dominant narratives of our society instead of the gospel narrative. Though Walter Brueggemann, among others, often points out how we deny the real underlying truths of the world that we buy into nonetheless. In fact, it's this great irony that we get scared of what uncovering truths around us might tell us about the dominant narratives we hold on to, especially when it comes to facing things like the dying of ideas, like that being American equals being in a privileged position opposed to all other countries, or even just world dominance. And though some are easier to let go of than others, it doesn't seem like a stretch to say that often people's resistance to change is fear of an old paradigm slipping away. You all know that often we say we're looking for the higher moral ground on issues that sometimes really we just don't want to have to deal with. For others, though, there's an anxiety present in taking a closer look at things because of the loss we're afraid it would bring of what we feel the dream of our lives is supposed to be. It's a scary thing to think about getting to the core of truth sometimes. Janet Malcolm writes that we're so used to perpetually smoothing and rearranging reality to conform to our wishes that we lie to ourselves and others almost constantly, unthinkingly. When occasionally, and not by our own efforts, but under the pressure of external events, we are forced to see things as they are, we are like naked people in a storm. Over the past few years, I've been privileged enough to spend a good bit of time at a monastery in Beech Grove, Indiana, a place where we sing and recite and chant the Psalms 3 times a day. As part of that experience, each time I am struck again and again by the raw honesty of the Psalms about the human condition. Words which unflinchingly name anger and lament and devastation and loss. And I've thought about how rarely in worship we reach that level of honesty. It's just not all that hard to understand, though. All too often we are more comfortable leaving a veil over the reality reality and heartache of what keeps us up at night. It would just be too hard if we left ourselves opened up all the time to the pain we each carry around with us. But what if that's not the only reality that would be there if we risked pulling the veil back on our lives more often? What if part of the church's job is to remind us that there is so much more that we forget is even there, when we're so determined to protect ourselves from drowning in pain? You see, it's easy to assume that, to use Malcolm's phrase, being naked in a storm will only result in something painful. And that may be, many times, all the time, in the world's paradigm. But surely our texts for today point to something else, an experience where the veil is pulled back on something in a way that shows its core to be filled with grace and light. Though they don't start out in ideal places, remember that the disciples that are along with Jesus are exhausted. And we understand why. They've had energy expended on crowds of thousands around them. They have hunger, literal and figurative. And they have this new way of living and serving that they have come to know. They've just come from one experience after another of giving to those around them. And then in the midst of that all, misunderstanding Jesus again and again. You know that kind of exhaustion, don't you? That comes from caring for another person, perhaps. The kind of tired that is more than just the little fatiguing challenges that build up in the midst of it. A good friend right now is spending lots of her time caring for her ailing mother. And she has the exhaustion of managing medications and making sure all of these symptoms are being paid attention to, dealing with dementia and the fear of nurses, and all of this has worked to a pretty exhausting place. And the disciples are clearly spent as they go up the mountain with Jesus to pray, slumping over in sleep when they get there. Only as Jesus prays, his face begins to shine. And this strange story becomes flooded with light. As Peterson puts it, the disciples rub their eyes to try and process it. Moses, Elijah, then a cloud that envelops them too, and God's own voice speaking to them. Celts call these kinds of moments thin places. I'm guessing you know. Places that are mediators of the sacred. When we feel the veil between the holy and mundane is pulled back enough to get a glimpse of the light that is there behind it all. On that day, surely the holiness shone through the humanness of Jesus in a way that was luminous, that was overwhelming. It's hard sometimes to know what to think when thin places come along. How to process them, those times when we're face to face with that old-fashioned word, glory. Sometimes, like Peter, we assume we have to do something with them. So sometimes we do try and enshrine a moment, find a way to make it more accessible next time, more attainable, more manageable. We try to control being able to experience it again. I have an idea. Let's make 3 memorials. I love how Peterson puts it. He blurted this out without thinking. But the truth is, sometimes it's not a whole lot easier to figure out what to do with light than it is what to do with pain. It's my suspicion that there are times when we may not be much better at facing light than we are darkness. Surely it too has the power to break us open in ways that can be frightening, which actually makes the Israelites' very different reaction to this kind of thing a little more understandable. Let's just get it covered up so we don't have to figure it out. It's easier to deal with the pain that we know than the light we can't explain. And the truth is that the gospel piece actually doesn't do a whole lot for us to explain what it is that happened here, what's going on or what it means. This text doesn't turn on Jesus saying something back to Peter that explains how he's missing the point, or that he shouldn't try and move to act on all of this too quickly. What this text turns on is a light, radiant cloud that, as Peter is babbling on, comes and surrounds them and silences them. And the words to them come from God, who simply says, listen. Listen to this one who at his core is light and love. Robert Brown Taylor says that biblical encounters have a way of breaking biblical people open, of rearranging what they think they know, so there is room for more divine movement in their lives. Though it's still tempting to want to know what these things mean, how to predict them, I wonder if simply we'd be better off just letting them open us up. In his book, Whispering the Lyrics, Tom Long tells a story about someone he had come across who had helped him to understand what he called transfiguration discernment. In order to become a minister in most denominations, a candidate must be examined and tested theologically. The church has a right and an obligation to know if a person is theologically sound, and Long tells of a friend of his, a veteran minister, who always asked the same theological question of every potential minister. He would have them look out the window until they could find a person walking by that they did not know. And then he would ask them, will you please describe that person theologically? Over the decades, he said, candidates tended to give one of two different answers. Some would respond, that person is a sinner in need of the redemption of Jesus Christ. Others would respond, whether they know it or not, that person is a child of God, loved and upheld by the grace of God in Jesus Christ. I suppose, he writes, that technically both of these answers are theologically correct. But it is my experience that those who give the second answer make better ministers. And the reason is, of course, that they have the gift of transfiguration discernment. They are able to see people in the present tense, and they see them in the future, loved and held by God. People with transfiguration discernment are the kind who come into our darkened versions of our stories and pull back the curtains on the window, who let the light in and remind us that there are a whole lot of ways to tell the same story. I love how Moses always took off the veil when he went to speak with God. Regardless of what the Israelites were frightened of, I love the idea that facing the presence of God is not something to hide from, but something that calls us to be as we really are. And guess what? It's not a presence that gives us a message from God that will result in devastation or guilt or regret, but a face that shines on us with light and love. It certainly puts a different perspective on what it means to pull back the veil on truth. How amazing to think that just when we might feel on the edge of an abyss of pain, we might find that the truth is we're surrounded with light. And maybe instead of enshrining or wanting to hide from it, it can give us strength. Strength to believe that underneath the anxiety and dread we have sometimes to face in our lives, there is a source of love and blessing for us. And that when we take time to acknowledge the realities of the world and even make confession of our own wrongdoing, that light can hold us up. can change the angle on what we know to be true. Every now and then we are gifted with a thin place that pulls back the veil to show us the light and love of the God we're trying to follow. Our faithfulness to that God will not be achieved by freezing these moments, but by letting them transform what we know of reality. And by following on in confidence that God is leading us and loving us, and that what lies ahead, no matter the struggle of the path to follow, will hold us all in love. Thanks be to God. with the breadth and length and height and depth of God's love for you, now and forever. Amen.